Everybody, it's Jeff, and here's what I did this morning on Workbench, where I stream my open source innovation work. Actually, that's a lie. This was not streamed, but I felt like I would do a recap on the work I did this morning anyway. First of all, yesterday off stream as well, I added slot support to vtemplate, so I'll show that in the demo here. So this morning I started pushing this more into the direction of an actual web framework. The main thing I wanted to accomplish was letting you define HTML templates in a file next to your Go component. So here's like the footer Go component, and then here is the template. This also involves setting up asset compilation, since they need to be accessible from within the WebAssembly binary. I ended up using VFS gen, which lets you define an HTTP file system variable that it uses to generate a replacement file that gives you the same variable and returns the same data, but from compressed data in memory. So this involves some experimentation to get right. It's using some build tags, and you have to write a generate script, and then you can hook that in here so that you can basically say go generate. And I like how it worked. I also had to, since I only wanted HTML files, I actually used a Pharaoh and a couple of its built-in file systems to wrap. Right, here's an Pharaoh file system that that lets you directly access the file system, and then I wrap that in one that limits it to a specific root path, so it's only gonna give you files that are in the root, which we define elsewhere. And then we filter it based on a regular expression to get HTML files. And then that Pharaoh file system we can wrap in an HTTP compatible file system, in which we can just say dir. I actually, surprisingly, was not super familiar with this interface. I mean, I knew that you could do HTTP dir and serve files that way, but I didn't know that this was kind of it's basically the only standard file system interface in Go. A Pharaoh is much more featureful, but it's not standard. Anyway, I like what I came up with. I also wanted to simplify how the Go components reference their template data. So as you can see here, we still define render, the vectd render method, but we just say WebUI render, and we pass in that component instance. This was done with a helper called vtemplate that basically looks up the file that the file name of the Go file that called it, cuts out the root path, replaces the extension with HTML, and then uses our assets and tries to look up that file. So this isn't called directly, this is actually wrapped in this render helper, and so that's where we call vtemplate, and then it does basically setting up vtemplate and tells it to parse it and then render the vectd stuff from that. And it still hard codes, the directives and the evaluator. There's no evaluator right now. But I imagine having some kind of application struct that you set up that lets you define these things, and then calling render would use those. But there is a way, there is a component registry. Those aren't hard-coded anymore. So there's just, really simple. I need to clean this up probably for, it's probably fine. But basically, you just register your components here. So in the init for every one of your components, you can just call WebUI register and give it a struct that you want to register. And lastly, I wanted to update the dev server that I've been using down here. Basically a bunch of code that I've had around and been reusing. Need to push it into the direction of like an actual proper software rather than just a bunch of copy and pasted code. But I needed to update it so that it would watch for HTML files, not just Go files, and then do generate and then recompile. I also updated the HTML that bootstraps the page. There is an HTML file here that then goes and fetches the WebAssembly and loads it up. It looks like this, which was mostly code that came from the WebAssembly examples for Go, but I kind of changed it so that I could reload it, and I added this, which contacts the dev server, and basically just once it gets any message, it reloads. And before I was refreshing the whole page, but I changed it so that it just reloads the WebAssembly instance now. And so the result is we can make changes, and it'll have more of that like hot reload feel where you don't see that it's reloading the page. So let's try and use that slots feature I mentioned in the beginning. The way it works is your component needs to have a field that takes that's a vectee list, and it needs to have this struct tag vectee slot. And eventually you'll be able to have multiple slots so that you can have named slots based on the name of your field name, but for now there's just one. And our footer doesn't really do anything with that. We can change that. We put in a slot right here. Oops, I already closed it. And so in theory there's a slot there, but we don't have any slot data. So let's go to our page view where we call the footer component. And so this is the point of a slot where you can actually put data inside here. And we can see it shows up there. So that's our slot. I mean, it doesn't make a ton of sense because we're just like taking our inner HTML and then putting it inside the other. You know, it's a contrived example, but it works, right? And you saw how it was this like real-time reloading. And pretty fast too, right? It's not only regenerating the assets and then recompiling, and then it's reloading. So it takes like about a second, but I mean that's pretty fast considering how little is going on here, right? This pipeline is so much simpler than any kind of JavaScript stack with Webpack and all the things you need to compile, multiple steps of JavaScript and like TypeScript and React and all these things that you have to worry about. This is just plain old Go being compiled with a little bit of code generation. And so it's very simple, right? There's way fewer files involved. There's way fewer configuration and like cruft. So I'm really excited about this as a framework. So what next? I guess the dev server could use some more work, but then it might be ready to build a real app with. So that's it for now. Let me know if you have any thoughts or questions in the comments. Subscribe if you'd like to start following along, or join me on Twitch Tuesdays and Thursdays. Thanks for watching. Bye.